Hey, what's up, everybody? Part 5 of my conversation with Lisa Bloom covers her thoughts on racism and equality. Take a listen. With that being said, I know we talked you talked a little bit about racism and how that's still playing a part in today's society. And us as African Americans, we have certain conversations with our children about equality in the country. But when you talk to your kids and you're talking to them about equality in this country, what kind of conversation? What do you tell your children, and what should people be telling their children about equality in this country?
So that's a wonderful question, too. I think equality and acceptance and tolerance of other people is a lifelong process. It's not something we just do once or twice or think about today and then never again. This is something that we all have to work on all the time. And not just with regard to race, but also with regard to gender, sexual orientation, and all of the other isms that divide us. A lot of people in America say, I'm not racist, I don't see color, I'm colorblind, right? Well, of course we do see color. If you met me and the next day you were asked what my race is, you would be able to answer that question, right? I mean, of course we see it. What we don't want to do is make judgments based on race, and we don't want to engage in stereotypes. And that's why I talk in the book about implicit racial bias. It's such an important concept that a lot of people aren't familiar with. Most of us would say we're not racist, but when we take the implicit racial bias test, which was developed by Harvard University researchers to test your hidden biases, most people, I think it's 80% of white Americans test for moderate or severe racial bias against African Americans, and about 50% of African Americans test for bias against their own group, which is very sad. So we have, the first step is to become aware of what's really going on, and that's why we have, I think, so much racial bias in our criminal justice system, because the stereotype of the black male criminal runs very deep. After that, I think it's very important that we talk about these issues. So many people in America are uncomfortable talking about race. This is one thing I have learned writing this book. I grew up with a civil rights lawyer as my mother. I have been a civil rights lawyer myself since 1986. So I've always been very comfortable talking about race and other social issues. But many other people are not comfortable. But nevertheless, I think we have to have these conversations. And I talk in the book about how we can do that. We can do it very inclusively. We don't need to point the finger at somebody and call them a racist, which just leads to defensiveness. But I think, for example, there's a judge I talk about in the book who tells jurors, many people in our culture have implicit racial biases. You might, without even being aware of it. I probably do, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. But it's very important in this case with two men of different races that you not take race into account, that you not make assumptions about somebody based on their skin color, for example, about whether they're aggressive or violent, criminal or not. And if there's any doubt, consider switching the races of the two men in your minds to see whether you would come to the same conclusions. I think that's a wonderful way to talk about race in a way that's inclusive and that's non-threatening, and that I think people can embrace without being defensive. So, I think we can have these conversations, and I think we need to have these conversations. And parents, I encourage parents to have these conversations in families. I think teachers and students in schools should have these conversations. It's a very healthy and necessary process.
And I'm glad you mentioned that because in today's society, social media, you can get on Twitter, send out a tweet, and you might have, the tweet that you sent, you meant it one way. But with everybody on Twitter, everybody's going to take it a certain way. And in today's society, what I've seen is America has become real sensitive on speaking about subjects that affect us every day. Like, for example, stand your ground law, or homosexuality and parenting and things that affect us. And like you're speaking about in your first book, Think. We have women and staying smart in a dumbed down society. people have become real sensitive about talking about sensitive subjects, when in years past that people were more eager to talk about those situations because they wanted to change. What has changed, in your opinion, from being able to be more vocal about these sensitive subjects in years past versus now?
Well, listen, when I was writing this book and really digging deep into the issue of race and especially racial bias in the criminal justice system, I would sometimes say to myself, who am I to write this book about race? And how is this going to be received? And are people going to say, who do you think you are writing this book? And then I thought, well, who am I not to write this book? For example, I talk about women's issues a lot. I love it when men want to get on board and talk about women's issues too, and, become feminists and talk, especially when they have daughters, men tend to become feminists, and say, what can I do?
Too,
So you know what I'm talking about. You want every opportunity to be open to her, and you don't want her to be, stuck in some category where she doesn't want to be just because she's a girl, right? And so, I thought of it that way, and I thought, I'm gonna push on. I'm gonna talk about race, and that's what I have done. And, listen, the haters are out there. They're out there on Twitter. They're out there everywhere. But I have received a lot of love, I have to say, from the African-American community. And one of the things that has struck me is perhaps there are not enough white people talking about racial issues, and that's been too much on the shoulders of the African-American community, and that's not right. In the same way that the gay community shouldn't have to shoulder the whole burden of equal rights for LGBT folks. And, we all need to support each other. And so one of the lessons I've learned is, perhaps all of us should consider doing something for a group that's not our group today. And, reaching out and saying, what can I do to help? I have also gotten a lot of love from the gay community for all the gay rights work that I've done. And people are just so appreciative. And to me, this is just basic, it's obvious, just equality. We're all equal. I don't think that's a hard issue at all. So, maybe that's something we can all do. Because I think the good news is we want to be egalitarian. I think we do believe in our founding principles of equality. Martin Luther King said, all we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. And we have these lofty promises on paper in our Declaration of Independence and the 14th Amendment to the Constitution and our civil rights laws, that we're all equal and that the laws give us equal protection. Well, it's up to all of us to take those values from the pieces of paper and bring them into action in the streets, in our homes, in our workplaces. It's up to us to do that. They're not going to spring to life off the pieces of paper on their own. But the good news is I think we can do that. I'm very optimistic.